Your schools lied to you. Your teachers lied to you. Don't get mad at me for exposing the truth. But Columbus didn't discover America. A black king did. And before you start crying about it, give me 30 seconds to explain. Almost 200 years before Columbus ever touched a boat, a West African ruler named Abu Bakr II had already sailed across the Atlantic. But I bet your school left that part out, didn't they? This man wasn't some minor tribal leader. He was the emperor of the Mali Empire, one of the richest civilizations to ever exist. Gold ran through its veins like water. While Europe was fumbling through the Dark Ages, Mali was thriving, educated, sophisticated, and wealthy beyond imagination. Abu Bakr was a visionary. Imagine sitting on a golden throne so bright it blinds your guests and still saying, "I need to know what's beyond that ocean." He built a fleet so massive the horizon disappeared under his sails. Some say 200 ships, others say thousands. And he didn't just send them, he led them. He passed his throne to his brother, Mansa Musa, the same man history calls the richest person to ever live, and set off to find what lay beyond the sea. Musa later told historians, "My brother did not return because he crossed the ocean." That one sentence rewrites everything we were taught. It means Africa wasn't waiting for Europe to discover it. Africa was already discovering the world. Indigenous people in the Caribbean and South America told stories about dark-skinned visitors who came generations before Columbus, wearing gold and speaking foreign tongues. Archaeologists have found African metalwork and symbols buried deep in those lands. But when the evidence surfaced, Western historians shrugged and called it coincidence. Coincidence? Come on now. You don't accidentally send fleets across the Atlantic. You don't accidentally chart the stars with that kind of precision. When Columbus made his so-called historic voyage, he was following paths mapped by people who looked like us. But the world couldn't handle that truth. They needed Africa to look weak, lost, and late to history. They couldn't have a story where a black emperor reached the New World first. So, they erased him. They took his name off the maps and replaced it with their own. But lies age badly and truth always floats back to the surface. The moment you hear Abu Bakr's story, history cracks open and you realize black excellence didn't begin with survival. It began with exploration. Picture this. Hundreds of ships stretching across the horizon, their sails catching the Atlantic wind, their crews made up of the best navigators in the world, black men from the Mali Empire. These weren't pirates or wanderers. They were scientists, sailors, and dreamers, guided by the stars, moving west into waters no European had ever dared to cross. While Europe still thought the ocean ended in dragons and death, Africa was out here testing the limits of the planet. That's not myth, that's recorded history. Chroniclers like Al-Amari documented how Abu Bakr launched one fleet, waited for its return, and when only one ship came back, he didn't panic. He built another bigger, stronger, and said, "I will go myself." That's not fear. That's purpose. That's vision. Now let's talk about what might have happened next. West African sailors already understood the ocean's currents. They used the same trade winds that later carried Columbus's ships centuries later. Those winds moved from Africa to South America almost like a highway designed by nature itself. They didn't need compasses. They had stars, rhythm, and centuries of seafaring experience. When Abu Bakr's fleet set sail, they weren't guessing. They were following patterns they had already studied. Every fisherman along the coast knew it. The ocean had a rhythm, and Mali knew how to move with it. Here's where things get deep. Centuries later, when Columbus finally reached the Caribbean, indigenous people there told him something strange. They said black men had been here before. They described them as dark-skinned visitors who came from the east, wearing gold and carrying spears with metal tips that didn't exist in the Americas. Columbus wrote it down himself. Let that sink in. The man they praise for discovering. America admitted in his own notes that Africans had already been there. Historians downplayed it for centuries, but the evidence keeps popping up like history, refusing to stay buried. In Mexico, archaeologists have found metal alloys identical to those used in West Africa at the time of Mali's Golden Age. In South America, ancient carvings show faces with full lips and broad noses, the same features of people from the Niger River region. Even ancient trade routes in Brazil contain fragments of copper and gold mixtures that match Malian craftsmanship. It's like Abu Bakr's ships left fingerprints across an entire hemisphere, and nobody wanted to admit it, because if they did, the myth of European discovery falls apart. Think about what that means. For centuries, they painted Africa as backward, tribal, uneducated. But here was an empire building ships that could cross oceans while Europe was still arguing about whether the earth was flat. That's why this story hits so hard. It's not just about one man's voyage. It's about reclaiming what was stolen from our narrative. Abu Bakr's journey proves that black people weren't just passengers in history. We were the captains. Every map they drew erased us, but every wave remembers our names. Imagine the scene. The sun setting behind him, the coast of Africa fading into gold. Abu Bakr standing on the deck of his lead ship, staring into the horizon. He knows he may never return, but he also knows that if his ships reach land, it will change the story of humanity forever. That's the spirit they tried to erase. The spirit that said, we don't need to wait for permission to explore the world. And whether or not Abu Bakr ever stepped foot on American soil, the legacy of his courage crossed the ocean. It's in the DNA of every dreamer, every builder, every black soul that refuses to accept the limits the world tries to hand us. This wasn't just a voyage. It was a statement, a declaration that Africa had the power to shape the world before the world ever gave it credit. And that's exactly why when Europe took control of history, they had to make sure Abu Bakr's name disappeared. Because one truth about a king from Mali could unravel their entire lie. When Europe finally caught wind of Abu Bakr's journey, they didn't celebrate it. They panicked. Because if a black emperor had already crossed the Atlantic, it meant everything they were building their future on was a lie. The myth of discovery, the illusion of white superiority, the idea that civilization began and ended with them. All of it collapsed the moment Africa took the lead. So they did what colonizers do best. They rewrote the story. They drew new maps, erased old names, and crowned their own explorers as heroes. By the time Columbus set sail almost 200 years later, the world had been rewritten to make him the first. But the irony is even Columbus himself admitted he wasn't. In his own journals, he talked about meeting dark-skinned people in the Americas who wore gold, spoke in unfamiliar languages, and carried metal weapons identical to African craftsmanship. He knew, and the European monarchs who funded him knew. But truth was bad for business, and they were building empires off deception. The cover-up didn't happen overnight. It was strategic. They started by controlling education, then religion, then art. They painted Africa as the land of savages while stealing African science, navigation, and trade systems to power their own expansion. They renamed our explorers, legends, our kingdoms, tribes, and our genius luck. They turned real emperors into myths so they could turn their own myths into history. Abu Bakr wasn't erased because he failed. He was erased because he succeeded too early. His story was proof that black excellence existed long before they wanted to admit it. Proof that Africa didn't need saving. It was already leading. Think about it. If Europe had admitted that Africa reached the Americas first, everything about the age of exploration falls apart. The gold they stole, the lands they claimed, the people they enslaved, it all becomes theft, not discovery. So they built a lie big enough to hide an ocean. They called it progress. They called it destiny. And they taught it to every generation like gospel. And while they were rewriting the books, Africa's stories faded into silence. The griots who once sang about kings like Abu Bakr were silenced, their records destroyed, their songs dismissed as folklore. But truth never dies, it just waits. Every once in a while, a crack shows through the paint. An old map labeled Guinea Coast to the land of the blacks turns up in a European archive. An African coin appears in a South American dig site. A scholar in Timbuktu uncovers another dusty manuscript describing a fleet that sailed into the setting sun. Each clue whispers the same thing. The story we were taught is not the story that happened, and the deeper you dig, the more you realize how intentional the cover-up was. They didn't just want to erase one man. They wanted to erase the idea that Africa could ever be first. But the truth is louder now than ever. We live in a time where the world is finally listening again. The same voices they tried to silence are echoing across documentaries, classrooms, and conversations just like this one. Every word we speak about Abu Bakr II is rebellion against centuries of falsehood. Every fact we share is a strike against the lie that discovery has a color. Because if a black emperor reached the Americas first, then everything we've been told about who shaped the world is upside down. And maybe that's the real reason his name vanished from the pages. They knew that if Africa remembered its explorers, it would also remember its power. Abu Bakr's disappearance wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of ours, the start of a truth that refuses to drown. Even when history tries to sink it, the deeper you dig, the harder it gets to deny that Abu Bakr's fingerprints are all over the Americas. You can change the story, but you can't hide the evidence forever. The ocean itself remembers, and so do the lands that welcomed him. Across the Atlantic, traces of Mali's influence linger in ways that defy coincidence. In Brazil, ancient tribes near the northeastern coast have oral histories of black visitors who came from across the sea, bringing gifts, gold, and wisdom. Their stories aren't vague myths. They describe massive canoes with sails, foreign languages, and intricate jewelry that shimmered in the sunlight. In Mexico, early carvings and temple art show faces that look undeniably African, with wide noses and full lips, features that mirror the people of Mali's Niger River. In Peru and Ecuador, archaeologists have found copper and gold alloys that match the exact chemical composition of metals used in West Africa during the 1300s. How could that happen without contact? It's not imagination, it's evidence. Even oceanographers back this up. The same ocean currents that carried Columbus west already flow naturally from West Africa straight into South America. It's like nature itself built a water bridge, waiting for those who had the courage to follow it. Mali's sailors weren't wandering. They were scientists of the sea. They mapped stars, read wind patterns, and memorized the rhythm of waves. Centuries later, when Europeans finally started crossing those waters, they were sailing the same routes Africa had already mastered. But in European retellings, those paths were suddenly discovered. That's not history. That's plagiarism. And the clues don't stop there. When Spanish explorers began mapping South America, they reported seeing black traders among indigenous groups who carried gold in Malian-style bangles. Some even wrote about settlements deep inland where the people spoke languages unfamiliar to any European translator. It's not hard to imagine what happened. Abu Bakr's ships reached the coast, traded, possibly settled, and left behind a blend of culture and knowledge. Then centuries passed, stories blended, and the world forgot. But the ocean doesn't forget. Neither do the stones. The same architectural patterns from the Mali Empire, terrace walls, circular compounds, and sacred geometric layouts appear in parts of Central and South America. Built long before Columbus arrived, historians call it coincidence. They said the same thing when African carvings turned up in the Caribbean, when similar drums were found in the Amazon. When identical agricultural techniques appeared on both sides of the Atlantic, you can only call it coincidence so many times before it starts sounding like denial. Even the indigenous languages whisper the truth. Some ancient words found in the Americas share eerie similarities to Mande words from Mali. Linguists have noticed parallel sounds and meanings that don't align with Asian migration routes but match transatlantic exchange. It's not proof of conquest, it's proof of connection. Africa didn't invade, it inspired. Abu Bakr's voyage wasn't about taking, it was about learning. That's what separates him from the so-called explorers who came after. He wasn't trying to claim new worlds. He was trying to understand them. And that's why his story hits so deep for us today. Because we've been taught that curiosity and greatness don't belong to us. That black people were always the explored, never the explorers. But Abu Bakr's story flips that script. It proves that centuries before colonial maps existed, we were already global thinkers, engineers, navigators, and leaders. When they drew their first maps, they erased our faces from the borders we had already crossed. But every artifact, every carving, every story told by the waves is a reminder that truth doesn't stay buried forever. The ocean has memory, and it's starting to speak again. Being first has never been easy, especially when the world benefits from pretending you never existed. For Abu Bakr II, leading that voyage wasn't just about curiosity, it was about rewriting what humanity thought was possible. But the tragedy of being first is that you become too powerful for the story they want to tell. Europe couldn't allow Africa to be seen as the origin of innovation. They couldn't admit that while their kings were fighting over crumbs, an African emperor had already reached across oceans. That kind of truth would have destroyed their entire foundation of superiority. So they built walls around it. They called it myth. They called it exaggeration. And eventually, they called it impossible. When Mansa Musa later ruled Mali, he became world famous for his wealth, his pilgrimage, his gold. But notice how even his story gets told without Abu Bakr's name attached. Musa didn't take the throne because his brother died. He took it because Abu Bakr left to explore. That's the part they never teach, because it reminds us that before there were colonizers, there were African explorers. And those explorers weren't lost, they were leading. The Mali Empire's power didn't come from luck. It came from intelligence, trade, and courage. Its rulers weren't sitting in huts. They were building cities, universities, and economies that Europe envied. The idea that such people could cross an ocean before Columbus shattered the illusion that Europe brought progress to Africa. In reality, Africa had progress long before Europe caught up, and that's why Abu Bakr's story was never allowed to survive. His voyage wasn't just a journey, it was a threat. If the world had accepted that a black man discovered the Americas first, the concept of European dominance falls apart. You can't discover a world that someone else already reached. You can't call yourself civilized while erasing the civilization that inspired you, so they silenced it. They erased his name from textbooks and buried his achievements under centuries of lies. Every time they told children that Columbus discovered America, they were reinforcing a system built on theft, not truth. But erasing Abu Bakr didn't erase what he represented. His courage lit a fire that never went out. It burned through generations of black minds who refused to believe the narrative that we came from nothing. It inspired the dreamers, the inventors, the scholars who knew deep down that their roots ran deeper than any European timeline could explain. And that's the beauty of this story. It's not just about the past, it's about us. It's about what happens when black people stop accepting the version of history that was designed to make them small. Abu Bakr's voyage is proof that our ancestors weren't passengers in the story of civilization. They were driving the ship literally. Even now, when you hear about Mali, they focus on Mansa Musa's gold, but not Abu Bakr's vision, because vision can't be controlled. You can steal gold, but you can't steal imagination. That's what scared them most. Abu Bakr proved that the African mind didn't need permission to explore, to create, to connect with the world. That's why the price of being first was silence. But that silence didn't last forever. And the moment you speak his name, the silence breaks again. Every time you say, Abu Bakr's a second, you're reminding the world that Africa led the way before it was fashionable to give us credit. So when they tell you Columbus discovered America, just smile, because you know better. You know, there was a king who crossed the Atlantic, not for conquest, but for knowledge. And that story, no matter how hard they try to erase it, will always belong to us. Every empire needs a good story, and Europe built theirs on a lie so big it became legend. They told the world that Columbus discovered America, that Europeans brought civilization to savages, that history began the moment their ships left the shore. And generation after generation, we believed it. We repeated it in classrooms, wrote essays about it, and celebrated it with parades. But when you peel back that lie, what you find underneath is the story of a black king who changed everything. And they couldn't let that truth breathe. So they replaced it with a hero who looked like them. They crowned Columbus the father of discovery because they needed a symbol of white genius. They needed a man whose face could stand at the front of their myth, even if it meant stealing the legacy of someone else. And that someone else was Abu Bakr's II. You ever notice how the story never quite makes sense? How can Columbus discover a land already filled with millions of people? How can you find a continent that already had maps, architecture, and trade? The only way that story works is if you erase everyone who came before. And that's exactly what they did. They erased the indigenous nations who built civilizations that rivaled Europe's. They erased the Africans who sailed there first. They erased the truth until all that was left was their version, the version that made them gods of history. But the lie had cracks from the start. Columbus's own journals mentioned seeing black men among the natives. He wrote about people wearing gold and using metal that came from West Africa. Even his crew questioned how the locals got those materials, but instead of investigating, Europe ignored it. The truth didn't fit the script they were writing. That script became their foundation. They turned theft into discovery, slavery into civilization, and colonization into destiny. That's the lie they sold to the world. But no lie lasts forever. Every generation, more people start asking questions. If Africa was so universalized, how did its sailors build ships that could cross an ocean before Europe even knew how to navigate properly? If Africa was so primitive, why do its architectural designs, astronomical systems, and languages show up in the Americas centuries before European contact? The answers are uncomfortable because they flip the narrative upside down. They revealed that Europe wasn't leading, it was catching up. When you understand that everything about the modern world looks different, you realize that our people were written out of greatness, not because we lacked it, but because we had too much of it. Abu Bakr's voyage wasn't lost to time. It was buried under propaganda. His name was scraped off maps, his records suppressed, his evidence labeled myth. They couldn't destroy the truth, so they buried it under their story. And that's how the Columbus legend was born. Not from facts, but from fear. Fear that the world would discover who really lit the first spark of global exploration. But here's the thing about lies. They require maintenance. They need to be repeated, retold, and reinforced. The truth, it only needs to be rediscovered once. And right now, that rediscovery is happening. Every time someone learns Abu Bakr's name, the Columbus story loses power. Every time a teacher questions their curriculum, another crack appears in the myth. They can't erase what the ocean already knows, and the ocean remembers everything. The lie built the legend, but the truth builds us. Because the moment you see that Africa wasn't late to the world, it led it. You start walking different. You start seeing yourself as part of something bigger than struggle. You realize our ancestors weren't just survivors of history. They were the authors of it. And that's a story no empire can bury forever. When they erased Abu Bakr II, they didn't just erase a man. They erased an entire mindset. They buried the idea that black people could be explorers, innovators, and visionaries before anyone else. And that lie didn't just shape history, it shaped how we see ourselves today. Because if you control a person's history, you control their confidence. You make them question their potential before they even start. That's what the eraser of Abu Bakr did. It stole the image of black excellence in motion. It made generations believe our ancestors were stuck in place while the rest of the world moved forward. But that couldn't be further from the truth before the West was even organized. Africa was connecting worlds, trading ideas, and moving with intention. And when they removed his name from history, they weren't just hiding a voyage. They were hiding the blueprint for global black genius. And that's the ripple effect. Every time we were taught that exploration began in Europe, it quietly told us that we were meant to be followers, not leaders. It told us that discovery wasn't something we were capable of. It's a psychological war disguised as education. That's why this story matters. It's not about correcting a few facts in a textbook. It's about correcting an entire worldview. Because when you realize that a black emperor sailed across an ocean before Columbus, it shatters every mental ceiling they have tried to place above you. Suddenly impossible. Doesn't sound so intimidating. It's crazy to think about, But even our curiosity was colonized. They made it seem like the desire to explore, to learn, to push boundaries was a European trait. But look at Abu Bakr's story. He gave up a golden throne just to chase a question. That's not greed or conquest. That's faith. That's vision. That's the soul of exploration itself. They erased that image because a confident, imaginative Africa was bad for business. You can't exploit a people who know they built the world. So they gave us a version of history where we were always the conquered, never the conquerors. Where our story begins in chains instead of crowns. That's why you have to understand the eraser wasn't an accident. It was a system. Every map, every painting, every classroom was a part of it. They needed to build a world where the black mind was seen as reactionary, not revolutionary. So they clipped the wings of history to keep us grounded. And that conditioning runs deep. Even now, when you tell people Africa reached the Americas first, some will laugh. Not because it isn't true, but because they've been trained to doubt their own greatness. That's how powerful eraser is. It makes the truth sound like fantasy. But here's the flip side. Once that truth sinks in, it's unstoppable. Because once you know Abu Bakr's story, you can't go back to believing the lie. You start to realize that the same blood that built the pyramids also built ships that crossed the Atlantic. The same creativity that built Mali's libraries and cities still runs through us. It's in every dreamer, every artist, every innovator who refuses to be boxed in. They erased Abu Bakr to silence that spirit, but all they did was plant a seed, and that seed is growing again. When you reclaim the stories they buried, you don't just honor your past, you rewrite your future. That's the ripple effect in reverse. The same way their lies spread across centuries, the truth can too. One truth at a time, one story at a time, one name at a time. Abu Bakr's story isn't just about proving who got here first. It's about remembering that we were never behind. Every lie needs proof, and Europe's proof was paper. The maps we grew up trusting weren't just tools. They were propaganda. They didn't show the world as it was. They showed the world as Europe wanted it to be. Every line, every name, every border was drawn to make Africa smaller, less advanced, less relevant. And right at the center of that deception was the story they refused to draw, the voyage of Abu Bakr. You'd think an empire that sent hundreds of ships across the Atlantic would have earned a place on the map, right? But look closely at those early world maps. There's no mention of Mali's expedition, no trace of Abu Bakr's fleet, no acknowledgement that the Atlantic had already been crossed. Instead, they redrew the oceans to make it look like no one from Africa could ever have reached the Americas. They didn't just erase our story, they re-engineered geography to make it impossible to believe. Take the Catalan Atlas from the 1300s, one of the most detailed medieval maps ever made. You'll find drawings of Mansa Musa holding a golden orb, proof that Europe knew exactly how rich and advanced Mali was. Yet nowhere on that map does it show Abu Bakr's expedition, even though it happened just years before. Why? Because to include it would mean admitting that Africa had mastered the ocean before Europe even dared to explore it. The silence wasn't ignorance, it was intentional. When the seagrapers drew the known world, they conveniently made sure that Africa's achievements stayed trapped on one side of the sea. They made sure that anyone looking at the map would think only Europeans were destined to sail west. And that's how they weaponized maps, not to chart the world, but to control how we imagine it. Maps became the foundation of their lie. They told generations that Africa was a footnote, not a chapter. They turned the Atlantic into a wall instead of a bridge. And we believed it because those maps hung in our classrooms, stamped with official seals and European signatures, backed by institutions that claim to represent knowledge. But here's what they didn't tell you. Those same maps change constantly. Every few decades, they'd redraw coastlines, rename lands, and reshape the world to match their ambitions. The moment they discovered something, they renamed it, claimed it, and erased whoever had been there before. That's not discovery, that's deletion. Even the map makers knew the truth was leaking through. Some old charts include mysterious symbols, dark-skinned sailors, unfamiliar flags, trade routes that stretched from Africa into the Atlantic but ended abruptly as if someone erased the rest. Those aren't mistakes. They're scars of censorship. They couldn't just tear the truth out completely. So they buried it in plain sight. And for centuries, those hidden clues sat there waiting for someone to notice. But now we see it. We see how maps were never neutral. They were narratives. And when Europe drew themselves as the center of the world, they drew Africa out of it. They convinced us that the story started in the north and ended in the west. But Abu Bakr's journey flips that compass upside down. It reminds us that truth doesn't need to be written on paper. It's carved in memory, passed through stories, and carried by blood. The real map isn't the one they printed. It's the one we're rebuilding now, piece by piece, every time we speak his name. Because once you realize the maps lied, you stop following them and you start drawing your own. You can bury a story, but you can't kill it. Every lie they told about who discovered what, who ruled where, who built what, it all starts to crumble the moment people start asking questions. And that's exactly what's happening right now. The truth about Abu Bakr II is rising back up, not from European libraries, but from African voices, African scholars, and the descendants of those who never forgot. In the old city of Timbuktu, tucked inside crumbling manuscripts, there are records that mention a ruler who gave up his throne to explore the Western Ocean. Those same writings describe ships loaded with supplies, men, and faith, sailing toward a land they believed existed beyond the horizon. That's not fantasy. That's a testimony. And while Europe tried to erase it, Africa wrote it down. It just took the world centuries to finally start reading again. Modern historians and scientists are now doing what should have been done long ago. They're connecting the dots. They're comparing ocean currents, analyzing shipbuilding methods, and matching metal samples from the Americas to West African origins. Every test, every document, every piece of evidence makes the story harder to deny. Even genetic studies hint that contact between Africa and the Americas might have happened before Columbus. The more they look, the more the puzzle pieces start fitting. And every piece they uncover exposes another lie we were fed in school. It's not just a correction. It's a revolution in how we understand history. But here's the part that hits the hardest. The return of this truth isn't just about academic recognition. It's about cultural resurrection. For centuries, Black people have been told that our history starts with slavery, that our ancestors were waiting to be discovered, civilized, or saved. But Abu Bakr's story rewrites that completely. It tells us we were already global, already advanced, already leading the world in trade, architecture, and intellect. We weren't behind, we were ahead. They took that truth away because it's powerful. Because when a people remember that their ancestors conquered oceans, the chains of inferiority start to break. That's why rediscovering Abu Bakr isn't just about pride, it's about healing. When you realize that Africa reached the Americas before Europe, something shifts inside you. It makes you see the world differently. Suddenly, the ocean doesn't feel like a barrier. It feels like a bridge that our people already crossed. The pyramids, the manuscripts, the ships, they're all proof that we were never meant to be forgotten. Abu Bakr's name coming back into the conversation isn't coincidence. It's correction. It's history finally exhaling after centuries of being silenced. And it's poetic, isn't it? The same ocean they used to transport slaves may have once carried kings. The same waters they used to chain us might have first been crossed by a man who proved we were limitless. That's what makes his story so dangerous and so divine. Because when the truth comes back, it doesn't whisper, it roars. And now that it's resurfaced, there's no turning back. You can't unlearn it. You can't unknow it. And you definitely can't ignore it. Abu Bakr's legacy has returned. And with it, so has the reminder that Black history didn't begin in bondage. It began in brilliance. Before Europe ever learned to navigate the stars, Mali had already built a world of its own, one that thrived on gold, trade, and knowledge. The Mali Empire wasn't just rich, it was organized, disciplined, and deeply intellectual. Its cities were vibrant centers of philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and art. Timbuktu alone had hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, proof that Africa wasn't just surviving, it was leading, while castles in Europe were still damp with candle smoke. Mali's mosques and palaces gleamed under the sun, carved with precision and built on mathematics that would later shape the Renaissance. This was the world that raised Abu Bakr II, a world so confident that its king could hand off his throne and still trust that the empire would flourish. That's not chaos, that's legacy. Mali's power came from more than gold. It came from vision. The empire connected the Sahara to the Atlantic, the Middle East to the Mediterranean, creating a web of trade and diplomacy that stretched across continents. Scholars from as far as Egypt and Spain traveled to study in Mali's schools. Poets wrote about it. Merchants bragged about it. Even Europe couldn't ignore it, though they tried. Abu Bakr didn't rise from a forgotten corner of the world. He rose from a global capital of brilliance. When he looked west across the Atlantic, he didn't see fear. He saw opportunity. His empire had already mastered land. The sea was just the next horizon. But here's where it gets real. The wealth and power of Mali were so unmatched that they forced Europe to pay attention. Stories of its riches reached Italy, France, and England, spreading faster than gold dust in the wind. And when Abu Bakr disappeared on his voyage, his brother Mansa Musa took the throne and his legend exploded. Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca was so extravagant that he gave away so much gold it crashed economies across North Africa and the Middle East for years. Imagine that a black king's generosity could shift global markets. That's how powerful Mali was. And yet, even with all that evidence of greatness, they still call Africa primitive. They still act like we showed up late to history when in reality, we wrote the first chapters. Every time you see a map that makes Africa look small, remember this: it was once the heartbeat of the world. It was the center of mathematics, architecture, and trade. The so-called dark continent was shining while the rest of the world was still trying to find fire. And from that brilliance came Abu Bakr II, a man raised on knowledge, surrounded by scholars driven by curiosity. He wasn't just a dreamer. He was the product of an empire that believed in possibility. The Mali Empire taught him that boundaries were illusions, that the world was meant to be explored, and that's what makes his voyage so revolutionary. Abu Bakr didn't sail west because he was lost. He sailed west because he was found. He knew who he was. He knew where he came from. And he wanted to know what else was out there. That's the mindset they never wanted us to inherit. Because if you believe, truly believe that your ancestors were kings who commanded fleets, not captives who were chained to them, then you start walking differently. You start thinking bigger. You start realizing that greatness is inherited, not granted. The world that Mali built wasn't just a chapter in African history. It was the foundation of global history. It showed that civilization, science, and exploration weren't European inventions. They were African continuations. And once you understand that, you'll never look at a map, a textbook, or a classroom the same way again. When the West first heard whispers about Mali, they didn't laugh. They took notes. European traders and scholars were stunned by the idea of an African kingdom wealthier, cleaner, and more advanced than anything they'd ever seen. They wrote about its gold, its scholars, its universities, and its order. They studied its trade systems and mapped its routes. What they couldn't match, they copied. What they couldn't copy, they stole. And what they couldn't steal, they erased. It's wild when you think about it. Europe learned from Mali long before it claimed to civilize Africa. Their mathematicians borrowed from African astronomy. Their architects studied Islamic and Mandi designs. Their traders followed the routes that Mali had already built. The West didn't invent the global economy. It inherited it from Africa and then took credit for it. When Mansa Musa's name reached Europe, they didn't see him as a man. They saw him as a legend, almost too great to be real. Artists drew him with a golden orb in his hand, a symbol of wealth so massive it broke imagination. But behind that image was a truth they didn't want to confront. If Mansa Musa could rule an empire like that, then Abu Bakr's voyage made sense. The power, the resources, the ambition, it was all there. Europe knew it. They documented it. But they were never going to promote it. Because how do you tell your children that the same people you enslaved once ruled the richest empire on earth? How do you justify colonization when the people you're exploiting are the same ones who taught you how to navigate the seas? So, they cherry-picked. They studied Mali's brilliance in silence, then rewrote it in their own image. They studied African navigation and called it European discovery. They learned African irrigation and called it innovation. They took the gold, the salt, the trade, the knowledge, and repackaged it as progress born in Europe. That's how they flipped the script. They didn't just colonize land, they colonized ideas. And every stolen idea became a weapon. Every time Africa taught, Europe translated it into power. What they didn't realize is that imitation doesn't erase origin. The more you look at what made Europe rise, the more Africa appears in the reflection. From compass design to architecture, from trade systems to scholarship, the fingerprints of Mali are everywhere. But to acknowledge that would mean admitting that black brilliance wasn't borrowed. It was original. That's why they taught us history in reverse. They wanted us to believe that we inherited civilization instead of creating it. But the truth is, they inherited from us. And it's almost poetic, isn't it? The West spent centuries building its prestige off Africa's blueprints while pretending those blueprints never existed. The irony is that the very ships that carried them to discover the world were modeled after African vessels. The very trade routes they used to build empires were first paved by African explorers. They learned the formula for greatness from us, then taught us to forget it. But history is starting to remember. Scholars, archaeologists, and storytellers are piecing it all back together, and every discovery points in one direction. Africa wasn't behind, it was ahead. Abu Bakr's story is the key that unlocks that truth. His voyage wasn't an outlier. It was the peak of an African tradition of exploration and innovation that the world pretended didn't exist. And once you see that, the whole picture changes. It's not that Europe discovered Africa. It's that Africa gave the world a head start. No matter how hard they tried to bury Abu Bakr's name, they couldn't bury the ripple he left behind. Because legacy doesn't vanish, it echoes. You can hide it from the books, but you can't erase it from the blood. The proof of his voyage lived on in the stories of the Caribbean, the languages of West Africa, and the shared rhythms of drums that beat across both sides of the Atlantic. The same percussive patterns that echo in black churches. The same call and response in African American gospel. The same syncopation in jazz and blues. They're more than music. They're memory. Memory that traveled across the ocean long before any slave ship did. That's the power of legacy. It survives even when history forgets. Look close enough and you'll see it everywhere. In the way indigenous communities in South America weave gold the same way Mali's craftsmen did, in the design of canoes that match West African styles, in the way certain crops and farming techniques crossed oceans before Europe had the tools to make it happen. Even DNA studies whisper the truth. Shared ancestry and genetic markers between West Africans and indigenous peoples in the Americas that predate colonization. That's continuity. Abu Bakr's fleet might not have made it home, but his people, his culture, his influence, they made it somewhere, and they stayed. But the legacy isn't just physical, it's spiritual. Abu Bakr's decision to trade a crown for a compass became a symbol of something bigger, the refusal to accept limits. That same spirit still runs through us. It's the same fire that built Black Wall Street, that powered the Harlem Renaissance, that put black inventors and thinkers on the map, even when the world tried to ignore them. It's the same energy that drives every creative, every visionary, every dreamer who refuses to stay boxed in, because that's what Abu Bakr represents. Limitless possibility. They tried to erase him because they feared what his story could inspire. If people knew that a black emperor had once crossed an ocean for knowledge, not conquest, they'd start to question everything they were told about Africa, about race, about power. Because history like that doesn't just rewrite the past, it rewires the mind. It reminds us that black greatness isn't rare. It's routine, that we come from kings, scholars, and explorers, not the caricatures they painted for us. That's why Abu Bakr's legacy still matters. It's not just about proving who got to the Americas first, it's about reminding us who we are. Every generation that learns his name chips away at the lies built over centuries. Every film, every book, every conversation about his story cracks open another door. You can't hide truth forever. It moves like water. It seeps through walls, floods through cracks, and eventually fills every room. And now it's overflowing. The world is starting to remember. They couldn't erase Abu Bakr because you can't erase what's already in motion. His ships may have vanished, but his vision didn't. His voyage wasn't the end of a story. It was the start of a movement. And that movement, That spirit of black exploration never stopped. It just took a few centuries for the world to catch up. When you build a lie that big, you spend centuries trying to cover your tracks. But the problem with truth is it leaves fingerprints. And no matter how many books they burned, how many maps they redrew, how many scholars they silenced, the evidence never went away. They could erase the names, but they couldn't erase the proof. Deep in African manuscripts, etched into the pages of history that survived wars, floods, and colonial theft, you can still find it. Records from the 14th century written by Arab historians describe the Mali fleet that sailed west. Some even mention how Abu Bakr himself led the second voyage after the first one never returned. These aren't myths, they're reports. People documented it while it happened. They knew exactly what Africa was doing. And then there's the physical evidence, the kind you can't argue with. Artifacts found along the South American coastline share chemical fingerprints with West African metals. In Brazil, explorers have unearthed spearheads and ornaments crafted with the same copper and gold mixtures used by Malian blacksmiths. That's not coincidence, that's contact. Pottery fragments, inscriptions, and carbon, dated remains all line up with the timeline of Abu Bakr's expedition. Even the ancient words used by certain indigenous tribes for traders from the east mirror phrases from the Mandai language family. The pieces fit too perfectly for this to be imagination. And what makes it undeniable is how these clues existed long before the modern theories of Afrocentric history ever did. The evidence was always there. Europe just ignored it. Some of it sits locked away in private collections and European museums, mislabeled or hidden under vague descriptions like origin unknown. But origin isn't unknown, it's unwanted. Because if they ever labeled those artifacts correctly, it would expose centuries of stolen credit. They don't want you to see that Africa wasn't just a continent. They want you to see it as a curiosity. But every time someone digs into the archives, the story peeks back through. And no matter how much they try to dismiss it, science keeps proving what their history books won't admit. Even ocean studies tell on them. When modern researchers traced Atlantic current patterns backward, they found that the routes Columbus took were nearly identical to the ones that naturally link West Africa to the Americas. That's the same current Abu Bakr would have followed. The water moves like a memory, carrying the ghost of his fleet across time. It's poetic justice, really. The ocean itself keeping score. And here's the thing. Even European explorers left breadcrumbs they didn't mean to. Some early Spanish and Portuguese maps show markings and coastlines that match African knowledge of the Atlantic centuries before their own voyages. Those details didn't appear out of thin air. They came from borrowed knowledge. They studied our routes, our stars, our winds, and then claimed them as new discoveries. They used our genius to build their myths, but the truth keeps breaking through. Every artifact, every manuscript, every map that doesn't fit their story is a reminder that history isn't a straight line. It's a circle. What we lost, we're finding again. What they hid, we're uncovering. And no amount of silence can smother evidence that speaks louder than words. Abu Bakr's journey is written in the metals, the manuscripts, and the memories that survived their flames. They burned books, but they couldn't burn truth. Every era has a moment when truth fights its way back, and right now, that's exactly what's happening. Abu Bakr's story is rising again, not as some distant legend, but as a mirror for who we are. Because his voyage isn't just about the past, It's about reclaiming the future. When we talk about him, we're not talking about some mythical king who might have sailed west. We're talking about a real African ruler who dared to do what no one else could imagine: cross an entire ocean, not for conquest, but for curiosity. That's the difference. Europe's explorers came chasing profit. Abu Bakr went chasing purpose. That alone changes the tone of everything. He represents something we've forgotten. That exploration didn't start with greed. It started with vision. When you think about what it means to be a black explorer today, to create, to innovate, to build from nothing, you're walking in Abu Bakr's footsteps. Whether you know it or not, that spirit is in the DNA of our culture. Every time someone breaks a barrier, pushes into spaces we weren't supposed to be in, that's the same flame that drove him to push beyond the horizon. They told him the ocean was endless, that nothing waited on the other side but death. But he didn't listen. He believed in something bigger than fear. That same energy is what carried Harriet through the woods, what built Tulsa from the ground up, what sends black creators into fields no one thought we'd dominate. It's the explorer's soul, unafraid, unbothered, unstoppable. And you know what's wild? The world acts like Abu Bakr's mindset is rare, like it's some anomaly. But look around. You see that same drive everywhere in our people. We've been exploring new worlds this whole time, from music to fashion to tech to space. We're still charting paths that didn't exist before we showed up. We're not just part of the story, we are the story. Abu Bakr just reminds us that this isn't new. We've always been explorers. It's just that they erased the chapter that proved it. Now that chapter is being rewritten. It's not coming from universities. It's coming from us, from storytellers, filmmakers, historians, and everyday people refusing to let truth die in silence. We're reclaiming our narrative in real time, piece by piece, clip by clip, generation by generation. And the timing couldn't be better, because when you realize your ancestors discovered continents, it changes how you move in the world. You stop apologizing for your brilliance. You stop shrinking yourself. You start realizing that history doesn't define you. You define history. That's what this whole story is about. Abu Bakr's journey wasn't just across an ocean, it was across time. It was a message sent forward to us saying, don't let them tell you who you are. Go find out for yourself. That's what explorers do. They search, they question, they refuse to settle. And that's what we're doing now, searching for truth in a world built on lies. So no matter how many times they rewrite the textbooks or change the maps, just remember we were never lost. The world just lost track of us. And now we're back. Let's get one thing straight. Abu Bakr didn't need to discover anything. Africa already knew the world was bigger than what the eye could see. The Mali Empire traded across deserts, oceans, and continents when Europe was still struggling to read maps without monsters drawn on the edges. So when Abu Bakr set sail, it wasn't discovery, it was confirmation. He wasn't lost at sea. He was expanding a global conversation. Africa had already started, but when Columbus showed up a century later, they flipped the script. They took a chapter that wasn't theirs and made it the cover story of the world. And that's how you erase a people without burning a single body. You burn their story instead. Here's the irony though. In their obsession to claim discovery, they exposed themselves. They admitted through their own words and maps that something was already here. People, trade, structure, civilization. So, what did Columbus actually discover? A world that already had black fingerprints all over it. You can't discover what another man already named, cultivated, and charted. But the lie worked because it came with ships, guns, and printing presses. The same tools that spread religion and war also spread propaganda. And that propaganda became our education. They rewrote geography, rewrote science, rewrote God, and we've been living inside their version ever since. But history has a funny way of correcting itself. As new evidence surfaces, old lies start to crumble. Scientists can trace ancient trade winds, carbon-dated seeds, and metals, all pointing back to West Africa. Even language patterns, those subtle rhythmic similarities between African dialects and indigenous tongues, prove cultural blending that shouldn't exist if we were never here. It's like time itself is testifying, saying the real discovery isn't who found America, it's who the world forgot. And that's what makes this story powerful, because this isn't about pointing fingers, it's about pointing truth. If you grew up thinking your history started with chains, imagine what happens when you realize your ancestors once crossed oceans before anyone else. It changes everything. It changes how you see education, how you see power, how you see yourself. You stop asking for permission to exist and start demanding acknowledgement. You stop chasing representation and start recognizing inheritance. That's the revolution. Abu Bakr unknowingly began forcing the world to redraw its history, one uncomfortable truth at a time. The real discovery isn't in the ocean, it's in the mirror. Once you realize who you are, no map can box you in. That's what they feared most. That's why they lied. Because the people who know they discovered before they were discovered don't submit. They rise. The truth has a way of sailing back, no matter how far you send it away. And now, centuries later, Abu Bakr's voyage is finally coming home. His story isn't just being told, it's being felt. Every young black person who starts digging into their roots, every historian who refuses to let lies stand unchallenged, every artist who paints Africa as powerful instead of primitive, they're all part of his fleet. They're all carrying the torch he lit when he left Mali's shores, because truth, like the ocean, can't be contained forever. It always finds a way to return. Think about it. Abu Bakr launched over 2,000 ships into the Atlantic. That wasn't luck or impulse. That was engineering, mathematics, and courage that still humbles modern sailors. He didn't just drift with the waves, he studied them. He trusted the stars, the tides, and his own people's brilliance. And now, the descendants of that brilliance are the ones reclaiming his name. We're the proof that his vision didn't die, it evolved. From digital storytellers to historians on YouTube, from filmmakers to educators, we're reconstructing what they tried to dismantle. It's not revenge, it's restoration. And that's why this moment matters so much, because for centuries, they made us believe Africa was a place people left in chains. But what if we told the truth that Africa was the place people left chasing knowledge? That before any empire discovered the world, a black man had already charted it. That flips everything. It means the modern world wasn't born from European courage. It was born from African curiosity. Abu Bakr didn't sail for power or glory. He sailed because he believed there was more. And that mindset right there, that hunger for more, is still in us. It's why we create, why we innovate, why we refuse to accept the ceilings placed over us. When you look at the ocean today, it's not just water, it's memory. Those waves have seen kingdoms rise and fall. They've carried stolen people, stolen gold, stolen ideas. But now those same waters carry something new. Our voices were crossing back over with knowledge, reclaiming what's ours and rewriting what they erased. That's poetic justice. That's balance returning. So when truth sails back home, it doesn't ask for permission. It docks with authority. And the world has no choice but to listen. Because this time the story isn't being told about us. It's being told by us. Abu Bakr's journey didn't end in the Atlantic. It ended here with us remembering. Imagine walking into an old European archive and tucked behind a stack of colonial maps. You find it, a faded parchment showing the Atlantic, and on it a hand-drawn route stretching from West Africa to the Americas. No Columbus, no Spain, just Africa, Mali, the man-day markings, the ships, the route, the proof that map exists, or at least versions of it do. And that's the thing nobody wants to talk about, because the moment you admit that Africa had mapped the Atlantic before Columbus ever touched the compass, everything else collapses. Every discovery, every first, every European fairy tale of exploration starts to unravel. These old maps, they leak truth like cracks in a dam. Some Portuguese and Arabic charts from the 1300s show coastlines that shouldn't exist yet. Rivers that wouldn't have been known unless someone had been there before. Trade routes between Africa and the Americas that line up too perfectly with ocean currents to be guesswork. And yet, when historians find them, they call it anomaly. They label it unverified. Not because it's wrong, but because it's too right, too black, too threatening. You ever wonder why so many early maps painted Africa massive and detailed? While the Americas were a blur, it's because Africa was already known. Africa was the center of the map. The libraries of Timbuktu had scrolls that recorded navigation routes across oceans, trade logs from kingdoms as far as Asia and South America, and star charts that rivaled the best of Europe. But when invaders came for Africa, they didn't just take gold. They took knowledge. They looted archives, burned books, renamed rivers, and drew new borders. That's how you erase someone from history. You redraw the world around them. And those stolen maps, they became the foundation of European exploration. The irony is so thick you can choke on it. The same maps that guided Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Melon were built on African mathematics and Arab African astronomy, but you'll never see that in your school books. They'll tell you Europe discovered the world while holding Africa's compass in their hands. The maps they didn't destroy, they locked away. Some sit in the Vatican, some in Lisbon, others in private collections labeled restricted access. But why hide old paper? Because those maps are receipts. They prove that the story of discovery was a remix and Africa wrote the original lyrics. That's why every time we tell Abu Bakr's story, we're not just remembering a man, we're redrawing the map. We're putting Africa back in the center, right where it belongs. The truth is, the real age of exploration didn't start in Europe. It started in Mali when a black emperor decided to see what waited beyond the horizon. And no matter how many times they redraw those lines, history always bleeds through the ink. You ever notice how silence can be louder than truth? That's exactly how Europe built its empire on silence. They didn't just conquer with weapons, they conquered with omission. They didn't have to destroy every record of Abu Bakr. They just had to stop mentioning him. That's how control works. You erase someone from the conversation, and over time, it's like they never existed. They made silence a weapon, and they used it to rewrite history one classroom at a time. Think about it. How do you convince the world that you discovered something already thriving? Easy. You shut up anyone who says otherwise. You build schools that teach one version of events. You publish books that glorify conquest and call it progress. You turn explorers into heroes and empires into saviors. And while you do it, you bury the voices that could prove otherwise. That's the silence that built Europe's empire. The kind that doesn't sound like lies, it sounds like nothing. Columbus became a holiday. Abu Bakr became a rumor. That's not an accident. That's design. Because once you erase a man like Abu Bakr, you erase what he represents: African power, black ambition, and global influence. They knew the psychological impact of that silence. They knew that if entire generations grew up never hearing about black explorers, they'd start believing exploration wasn't in our DNA, that we were meant to follow, not lead. That's why this story matters. Because every time you say Abu Bakr's name, you break that silence. But here's the part that really stings. Europe didn't just silence Africa's voice, they built their entire identity on it. The age of discovery wasn't about discovering the world, it was about discovering how to control the narrative. The Spanish, Portuguese, British, they all used the same playbook. They took African gold to finance their voyages, African knowledge to guide their ships, African men to row their boats, and then told the world Africa had no history. That's like stealing someone's lyrics and calling yourself the artist. The silence became profitable. It became power. Because when you control the story, you control how people see themselves. You control who gets to be called civilized and who gets called savage. You control who gets credit for genius and who gets written off as primitive. That silence didn't just protect their lie, it built their world. But here's the thing. Silence only lasts as long as nobody speaks. And right now, the silence is breaking because the truth doesn't need permission. It just needs amplification. Abu Bakr's story isn't whispering anymore. It's roaring. And that roar is shaking the foundations of every classroom, every textbook, every history channel that's ever sold us half a story. The silence that built their empire is the same silence that's going to tear it down. Because you can't erase a people who remember. And we remember. Abu Bakr didn't just sail into the ocean, he sailed into legend. Not the kind you read in dusty books, but the kind that lives in your bones. Because what he did wasn't just exploration, it was liberation. He refused to believe that the world stopped where the map ended. And maybe that's why they had to erase him. Because he proved something that scared every empire that came after. That a black man could lead with vision, wealth, and courage, and didn't need Europe's permission to do it. That's the kind of story that threatens entire systems. That's why they buried him. But they didn't realize that legends buried under sand still grow roots. Every time someone says his name, Abu Bakr rises again. Every time a young black creator, inventor, or explorer steps into something new, his spirit sails again. His voyage wasn't about geography. It was about possibility. He didn't discover land. He discovered himself. And now, generations later, we're rediscovering him. His journey wasn't a failure. It was a prophecy. Because the world he dreamed of, a world where black people defined their own story, is finally happening. He was ahead of his time. And maybe that's why history couldn't handle him. Think about it. How many kings do you know gave up everything just to seek truth? Not for glory, not for conquest, but for knowledge. That's what separates him from the rest. While others were chasing crowns, Abu Bakr chased the horizon. That's what makes him eternal. They called him lost, but maybe he was never lost. Maybe he found something the world wasn't ready for. And maybe that's why his name disappeared. Because once you realize that the first man to cross the Atlantic might have been African, it forces you to question every story you've ever been told. But that's the beauty of truth. It always circles back. The waves that once carried Abu Bakr west are the same waves now carrying his story home. And it hits different, doesn't it? To know that before the chains, before the lies, before the textbooks, there was a king, a black king, who looked at the ocean and saw opportunity, not fear, who didn't wait for someone to tell him it could be done. He just did it. And now, his spirit lives in every dreamer who dares to go beyond the line, every artist who creates against the odds, every black voice that refuses to be silenced, because that's the real legacy of Abu Bakr II. He showed us that exploration isn't about finding new lands. It's about rediscovering who we've always been. The kings, the scholars, the innovators, the first, the ones they tried to erase. They told us we were passengers in history, but Abu Bakr reminds us we were the captains all along. His voyage never ended.